Hi guys, this is Jeff Coronado on behalf of JCSE, and this is another session in Bridging the Gap. So for those of you who are not familiar with Bridging the Gap, please, by all means, go to the introduction video on our YouTube channel. So you would go to JCSE LLC, and then I think automatically the introduction will pop up. And that'll give you some background information on the purpose of Bridging the Gap, what we cover, what we do here. So hopefully that will clarify that. So with that said, let's jump into the session that we're doing here. And that is, let me clear the screen here. So that's going to be this session. So our title is WW12. It's an exterior rafter to exterior beam connection. This is the first session in that sequence. So what we're going to cover is what are the components in an exterior rafter to an exterior beam connection. So here we have a pretty typical assembly of what typically a rafter, an exterior rafter to an exterior beam connection will look like. And we'll cover some of the elements in this assembly and also note one element that is missing, and that is there is no ceiling element here, right? So for those of you who are expecting to see some kind of a ceiling element, remember going across here, you'll notice how that's missing. And so we'll cover how this is stable, how this assembly is stable without that. But for now, okay, so the first element that I'm showing you here in this assembly is with the red arrow, what we're highlighting there is the first item that we're covering, which is the 2x ridge board. So you'll notice the characteristic diagonal X going through it to indicate that it's a continuous member. That's what we typically refer to as a ridge board. And also notice that it is one size larger than the adjacent rafter. So for instance, hypothetically, if your rafter is a 2x8, what we're typically going to do is put in a 2x10 ridge board. If your rafters is maybe a 2x4, what we're typically going to do is put in a 2x6 ridge board. So that's your ridge board. Now in yellow, what I'm pointing to is the beam in this assembly. So that's your exterior beam. You'll notice how it's a little bit wider than that ridge board. So without seeing any dimensions, I'm going to guess this is at least a 4x, if not a 6x, but probably a 4x beam. Now let's get to the rafters. So we have 2x rafters here. Excuse me. We have 2x rafters. Now with the light green arrow right here, what we're pointing to is that this is another rafter. So really light green is pointing to a rafter and the blue arrow is pointing to another rafter. These cut lines just means that we're shortening the length of how we're illustrating the rafter, but this is in reality all one rafter going across here. So this is one rafter, and then on the other side of the ridge board is another rafter. So the light green arrow is pointing to a rafter, and you can see what we call a cut line here, which means we truncate this. We're not showing the rest of the rafter. It continues, but we're only showing this much of it. The idea is that typically when we do this is because it's going to be either a mirror image, if we were to continue on this side of the ridge board from what we're seeing on the right side, or it's a whole different condition, in which case that's illustrated in another connection. Okay, so we've got a rafter extending to the left of the ridge board, which is what's shown in with the light green arrow. We have a rafter extending to the right of the ridge board, which is shown with the blue arrow. This rafter is going to span from the ridge board and be supported on the beam that we talked about that's pointed to with the yellow arrow on the right side. So that's the rafter. Now, however, notice this rafter has an extension. It continues beyond the beam, and that's what we're showing with the magenta arrow. So this rafter has an overhang. We do show a cut line here, but in all likelihood, this does not extend much further than this cut line. It's only an overhang over the beam. Let's see. Okay, now let's cover the 2x blocking in this assembly. So that's pointed to with the orange arrow, and it's going to be, the block is being placed, or these blocks are being placed between the rafters and on top of the beam. Okay, so that would be kind of like, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Try again here. That would be kind of this guy right there. Okay, so the blocks, they're made out of 2x, and they'll fit between the rafters and above the beam. Okay, now the teal arrows. So the teal arrows right here, so we've got 3 of them. Here's one, here's a second teal arrow, and here's a third one. The teal arrows are pointing to the wood structural panel. So we typically abbreviate this WSP. For old timers like me, we just used to refer this to plywood as plywood. So it could be plywood, but could be also other materials such as oriented strand board. So that's our wood structural panel. You can see it's the sliver. It's illustrated as this sliver, if you will, right above the rafter here and right above the rafter over here. Okay, so that's our wood structural panel. If you still call it plywood, I suppose there's no harm in that. But the more current, the more contemporary nomenclature for that is wood structural panel. Now with the black arrow, what we're highlighting there, and I know that it's difficult to see, so bear with me, but there is a nail there. The nail head is going through the WSP and into the block. Okay, so if you look closely, you'll be able to see the nail going through the WSP into the block. That's what we would call typically a diaphragm nail. We'll get to that more a little bit later, but that's our diaphragm nail there. I'm sorry, that's our diaphragm nailing. I shouldn't say nail because it isn't one. It's only one here because we're cutting a section through this assembly. But if we were to go in and out of the page, then we would see a row of nails where here we only see one nail. Okay, that's our diaphragm nail. Now I'm using the brown arrow to point to a toenail. So that toenail is connecting the block to the beam. Again, I apologize. I do realize it's probably a little hard to see on the screen. When we get into this in some of the other sessions in the, what is this, the WW12? Oh, well, we'll cover this at the end. But whatever the sequence is of bridging the gap sessions, we'll cover this toenail in more detail. So we'll be able to see it more clearly then. But for right now, it's just an overview of the assembly. That's the toenail. It's at an angle, okay? So it kind of goes at an angle. Hopefully you can see that it's going from up here, so top right, downwards to the left. So it goes kind of a little bit through the bottom side of that block and into the beam is the idea, okay? And that's why it's called a toenail, because it is going at an angle. Lastly, we've got, let me use what, dark green? I'll use dark green to illustrate this hurricane tie. So there's a hurricane tie. Basically, it's a connector that goes between the rafter and the beam. It connects those two when we refer to that as a hurricane tie. Okay, so with that, let me clear the screen, and that concludes this first session in this first session in the WW12 sequence. It's the assembly for the exterior rafter to exterior beam connection. Other related sessions in bridging the gap. Again, you can take a look at the introduction to understand a little bit better what bridging the gap is all about. But also stay tuned to other Bridging the Gap sessions entitled WW12, or look in our channel for any other sessions that are entitled WW12, and you'll find then other sessions that cover different aspects of this assembly, of this connection. If you found this to be helpful, please give us a thumbs up. Sure would appreciate that. And also feel free to subscribe to our channel so that you can stay tuned and monitor other Bridging the Gap sessions, as well as receive notifications of when we put up other Bridging the Gap sessions. Just hover over the JCSE logo on the bottom right, and you can click on it. You can subscribe to the channel. I believe you can then toggle in there and set it so that you receive notifications of when there are new Bridging the Gap sessions. And with that, we conclude WW12-1.